Picture this: battle-hardened Vikings, men who had raided Paris and conquered England, running for their longboats through Newfoundland forests. Behind them, shadows move between the trees. Arrows whistle past their heads. These are the same warriors who laughed at death, whose grandfathers had terrorized every coast from Ireland to Constantinople, and they are fleeing from hunters who carry weapons made of stone. 470 years before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing west, the most feared warriors on earth met their match on American shores. Not from an empire, not from a rival army with siege engines and cavalry, from canoes carrying native defenders who had never seen iron, never touched steel, never worn armor, and never heard a Norse name. They carried bows made of hickory. They carried tomahawks balanced for throwing. They carried stone points designed to shatter inside wounds. And with those weapons, those stone and wood and bone weapons that any Viking would have dismissed with a sneer, they did what no European army had ever done. They stopped the Norse expansion cold. Within days, the unstoppable force that had swallowed Iceland, conquered Greenland, and reached across the Atlantic came to a permanent halt. They would never return. But the story begins with a prophecy. Days before the final battle, a man named Thorvald Eriksson, son of Eric the Red, brother to Leif the Lucky, stood on these same shores with a stone arrowhead embedded beneath his arm. He looked at the small point, crafted by hands he had dismissed as primitive, and spoke the words that would echo through the sagas for 1,000 years. "This arrow will cause my death." He was right. He was dead within hours, and his death was only the beginning. By the end, you will understand how stone defeated steel, why the Vikings never came back, and how the single most unlikely thing on that battlefield, a terrified bull, saved the Norse from total annihilation. Europe in the year 1000 trembled at one word: Viking. From London's burning churches to Paris's ransomed walls, Norse longships meant death. Their expansion seemed unstoppable. Iceland fell. Greenland fell. The Atlantic itself could not contain their ambition. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and found something extraordinary: a land of timber for ships, because Greenland had none. Grapes growing wild, worth more than gold in medieval Europe. Fertile soil for farming. Salmon leaping into nets. A winter mild as Norwegian spring. He called it Vinland, land of wine. Paradise compared to Greenland's frozen misery. The sagas describe butterflies thick as snow, salmon leaping into nets, winters mild as Norwegian spring. Consider what this meant to a civilization cramped on frozen rocks, where nothing grew and every plank of wood had to be imported across treacherous seas. Vinland was not just opportunity, it was survival. Greenland's colonies clung to existence by their fingernails. Without new resources, without timber and grain and game, those colonies would wither and die within generations. Vinland represented everything Norse expansion craved, and the strategic implications were staggering. Establishing permanent settlements would secure Norse dominance of the North Atlantic for centuries. Fail, and Greenland itself might not survive. The Viking mindset demanded expansion. Their gods rewarded the bold. Each generation must claim new lands or face shame. Younger sons needed kingdoms, ships needed timber, people needed food. And Vinland had everything. 3 names would write this chapter. Leif Erikson, who discovered Vinland by accident. His brother Thorvald, who sought glory to match his famous sibling. And Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy merchant prince who saw gold where others saw grapes, and who would bring the largest Norse expedition ever assembled to American shores. But who were the people already living there? The Norse called them Skraelings, a word meaning wretched ones. Modern archaeology suggests Beothuk hunters, possibly ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, perhaps both. The name does not matter. The contempt behind it does. Because a native hunter crouched in Newfoundland timber could thread an arrow through a gap in the branches that a Viking archer would not even see. A warrior with a tomahawk could strike 3 times in the span of a single axe swing. A tracker could read footprints on frozen ground the way a Norse navigator read stars. These so-called wretches would accomplish what no European army, no rival Viking clan, no force on the continent of Europe had ever managed. They would stop the Norse expansion permanently and send the conquerors home in their own longboats, on their own ground, with weapons shaped by generations of forest hunting. They were not inferior to steel. They were superior to it. Every trail, every hiding spot, every tactical advantage the forest offered was written into their bones by generations of living on it. Where Vikings saw empty wilderness waiting to be claimed, natives saw a homeland under threat. 2 worldviews about to collide with explosive force. But the first encounter set a pattern that would doom every Viking who set foot on this shore. And it began with 8 men who never woke up. The first recorded encounter between Vikings and Native Americans was a massacre, and the Vikings started it. Thorvald and his men discovered 9 natives sleeping under overturned canoes on a beach. They killed 8 before they could rise. 1 escaped into the forest. That single survivor is the most important person in this entire story. Within hours, every native group within 50 miles knew about the pale strangers who killed without warning. The rules of engagement had been written in blood. 1 man running through the forest with the news of what happened on that beach changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Thorvald did not understand what he had done. He sneered at the dead, saw their hide clothing and stone weapons, and dismissed them as primitives. His men celebrated their easy victory. And then movement on the water. Skin boats. Dozens of them, approaching fast from the coastline. Thorvald ordered his men into shield wall formation. But there was no time. The arrows came from everywhere at once. 1 arrow found the gap that armor could not protect. It curved beneath Thorvald's shield and struck him under the arm, burying a stone point deep into his side. He looked at the arrowhead, pulled it from his flesh, and spoke the words the sagas would carry for 1,000 years. I have gotten a good land in my grasp, though I will enjoy little benefit from it. He was dead within hours, the son of Eric the Red, killed by a stone point crafted by hands he had called wretched. His men buried him on the shore he had tried to claim. They marked the grave with wooden crosses. The new religion mixed with the old habits of conquest. But the grave would not last. The land would swallow it, as it would swallow every trace of Norse presence on these shores. His death changed everything. Where Vikings expected easy conquest, they found determined resistance. Where they anticipated primitives who would scatter at the sight of steel, they encountered tactical sophistication refined over generations of forest warfare. Every child in these native communities learned to move silently through undergrowth before they could run. Every hunter could vanish into green shadows. Every warrior understood that patience trumped aggression in the dense timber where visibility ended at arm's length, and the terrain itself had chosen sides. Newfoundland's forests were the opposite of every battlefield Vikings had ever mastered. Thick undergrowth that grabbed at legs and caught on axe handles. Canopy so dense that noon felt like dusk. Sounds muffled and distorted in every direction. Sight lines measured in feet, not the hundreds of yards that shield wall combat required. Vikings excelled at open ground warfare. Shield walls on plains. Cavalry charges across fields. Naval engagements in fjords and open water. These were the tactics that had conquered half of Europe. But forest warfare, ambush tactics, guerrilla resistance, these were not in their playbook. They had entered an arena where every rule they knew was wrong, where armor became a burden that slowed you down, where formations became targets that could not maneuver, where bravery became foolishness because the enemy you charged at simply vanished into the trees and reappeared behind you. The land itself was a weapon, and it belonged to the people who lived on it. Karlsefni arrived the following year with the largest Norse expedition ever sent to the New World. He knew about Thorvald's death. He dismissed it as bad luck, the result of carelessness and aggression. Karlsefni would be different, cautious, diplomatic, smart. He brought trade goods alongside weapons. He would establish peaceful relations first, use force only if necessary. He was wrong about almost everything, but he was right about one thing. He could not repeat Thorvald's mistakes. Unfortunately, he would make entirely new ones. Karlsefni arrived with 160 settlers, including women and children, 30 battle-hardened warriors in mail armor, 5 long ships carrying cattle for farming, tools for building, and weapons for conquering. He chose a defensive position near the coast, high ground with clear fields of fire, and built longhouses designed to double as fortifications. Sentries posted day and night. He would not be caught sleeping like the 8 men on the beach. The first contact came at dawn, canoes emerging from morning mist like ghosts on the water. Vikings scrambled for weapons, shields raised, arrows nocked. But the natives did not attack. They stared, both sides frozen in mutual assessment across the water. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the canoes withdrew. Hearts pounded in the aftermath. What did this mean? 3 days later, the natives returned. This time they carried furs, the universal trade language of the frontier, goods for goods. Karlsefni made what seemed like a brilliant decision. He offered milk from his cattle. The natives had never seen cows, never tasted milk. Their wonder at this strange white liquid broke the tension. Laughter replaced suspicion. Trade began. For precious moments, history teetered toward peace. Natives brought pelts worth fortunes in European markets. Vikings offered milk and red cloth, exotic treasures to native eyes. No common language, but pointing and gestures sufficed. Children peered from behind their mothers. Warriors lowered weapons. Perhaps Vinland could be shared after all. And then trust died in a single heartbeat. A young native, fascinated by Viking steel, reached for an axe. Its weight, its balance, its edge, all alien perfection to someone who had known only stone. A Viking moved to stop him. Hands grabbed. The struggle lasted seconds. The axe fell. Blood sprayed across trade goods. The sagas differ on whose blood it was, Viking or native, accident or attack. What matters is the result. The native seized the axe and ran. His people vanished into the forest within heartbeats. Behind them lay a corpse and shattered peace. The milk of friendship had curdled into the poison of war. What followed was psychological warfare of a kind Vikings had never experienced. The natives vanished, not for hours, for days. No canoes on the water, no movement in the trees, no sound except wind and birds. The forest that had teemed with life went silent, and the silence was the weapon. Every snapping branch became an enemy. Every bird call might be a signal. Sleep came fitfully. Nerves frayed. Warriors who had faced shield walls without flinching jumped at shadows. Viking patrols found signs that chilled them. Broken arrows left deliberately in paths, warnings or threats. Footprints that appeared and vanished as if the forest floor itself swallowed them. Fresh marks on trees, counting Viking numbers or marking attack routes. The evidence mounted into a single terrifying conclusion. They were surrounded by an enemy they could not see, could not find, and could not fight. The natives had spent generations perfecting this form of warfare. Not the warfare of open fields and massed formations, the warfare of patience, of observation, of knowing exactly when to strike and exactly when to disappear. They had watched these strangers for weeks, cataloged every weakness, noted every routine, measured every response time, and now they had withdrawn not out of fear, but out of calculation. The attack would come when they were ready, not before. How do you form shield walls against shadows? How do you prepare for an enemy who exists everywhere and nowhere? Every tactic that had worked from England to Russia became useless in these forests. They were not fighting men, they were fighting the land itself, and the land was losing patience. When the fifth dawn came, they would face a form of warfare they had never imagined. And the thing that saved them was not a sword or a shield, it was a bull. Dawn on the fifth day exploded into chaos. Hundreds of skin boats materialized from hidden coves in 3 directions simultaneously. Ocean approach, river flanking, forest emergence. They moved in perfect coordination. No war cries, no horns, just silent approach in disciplined formation. The Vikings had expected screaming charges like European enemies. This silent advance chilled blood more than any berserker rage ever could. These were not savages. These were professionals who had turned their homeland into a fortress. The Vikings counted 30 boats, then 50, then stopped counting. Each carried 5 to 8 warriors. Simple mathematics turned terrifying. 300 attackers minimum against 30 armored Vikings and 130 settlers, most of them women and children who had never held a weapon. The first volley darkened the morning sky. Vikings raised shields instinctively, forming the wall that had never failed them. Overlapping wood and iron, each man protecting his neighbor, spears bristling outward. From England to Russia, the shield wall meant victory. Arrows struck with sounds like hail on rooftops. Then physics went wrong. The native archers used shorter bows and fired in high trajectories. Their arrows did not strike the shields from the front. They fell from above, arcing over the wall and finding the gaps between shields and helmets. A Viking screamed with an arrow through his foot. Another gasped as a stone point found the neck gap in his chainmail. The wall that had never broken began to crack. Then came the false retreats. A group of warriors charged the Viking lines, hurled tomahawks at close range, then fled toward the tree line. Young Vikings, blood hot with battle fury, chased them. Karlsefni screamed to hold the wall, but warrior instinct overwhelmed discipline. 5 Norsemen pursued 20 natives into the forest. The trap closed instantly. Those 20 became 60 as concealed warriors rose from undergrowth on every side. The 5 Vikings found themselves surrounded in thick timber, where their long-handled axes caught on branches, where their heavy armor exhausted them, where every advantage they had trained for became a liability. The natives moved through familiar terrain with terrifying speed, tomahawks finding every gap in Norse armor. 3 strikes per second from a practiced hand. The tomahawk was not a crude weapon. It was a precision instrument, balanced for both throwing and close combat. Designed by generations of warriors who understood exactly where the human body was vulnerable and exactly how much force was needed to end a fight. In open ground, a Viking axe could cleave a man in 2. In thick forest, the weapon was as likely to embed in a tree as find its target. And in that heartbeat of vulnerability, when the blade stuck and the warrior stood exposed, the tomahawk always found its mark. From the village, a sound built that no Norseman would ever forget. The war cries of hundreds of warriors taking the field. Different nations, different songs, creating a wall of sound that carried over the clash of weapons. Women trilled encouragement from concealed positions. The sound alone was enough to break a man's nerve. The kill ratio after the first hour stunned the Norse. 8 Vikings dead, 12 wounded, against perhaps 4 confirmed native casualties. The technological advantage that should have guaranteed victory was not just absent. It was reversed. Stone weapons in the hands of men who knew exactly where to strike, who moved through the forest like water through roots, who attacked and vanished, and attacked again from a different direction, were more effective than steel wielded by strangers on unfamiliar ground. Native hunters who had climbed trees before dawn rained arrows straight down from the canopy. where helmets could deflect some, but shoulders, hands, and feet were fully exposed. The Norse had never conceived of three-dimensional combat. Death came from a direction they did not know existed. The forest consumed isolated Vikings. Men who had navigated trackless oceans became lost within 50 yards of camp. They called for help, revealing positions to native hunters who struck from concealment and vanished before a blade could answer. And then, the impossible happened. Karlsefni's bull, brought across the Atlantic for breeding stock, broke free from its pen. The massive beast, maddened by battle sounds and the scent of blood, charged through the combat zone with the blind rage of an animal that does not understand war, but understands fear. It weighed more than any three warriors combined. Its horns were longer than any lance, and it moved with a speed that nothing in the native experience had prepared them for. To Vikings, this was livestock, an animal they had fed and watered for months at sea, cursed every time it shifted weight on the rolling deck. But to natives who had never seen cattle, never imagined such a creature existed, this was a demon summoned from whatever hell these strangers called home. The bull's appearance shattered native momentum in an instant. Warriors who had faced armored Vikings without flinching fled from this bellowing monster. Its horns caught one warrior and tossed him into the air. The psychological impact was devastating and immediate. What other demons did these strangers command? What other beasts waited in those wooden houses? Karlsefni seized the moment with the instinct of a man who understood that this was his only chance. Form up, shield wall, back to the longhouse. Vikings retreated step by step, shields locked, dragging wounded, while the bull's rampage bought precious minutes. Native attack coordination collapsed as warriors tried to process this supernatural threat. The temporary advantage let the Norse reach their defensive positions. The longhouse, built for exactly this possibility, had firing slots and reinforced walls. Women passed water to exhausted warriors. Wounded received basic treatment. Weapons were redistributed from the dead. But the respite was brief. Night brought fire arrows. The wooden longhouse became a potential death trap. Women and children fought flames, while men held the walls. Dawn revealed the mathematics of annihilation. Viking dead mounting, native numbers unchanged. If anything, more canoes dotted the water, more shadows moved between trees. The technological advantage had meant nothing. Weapons that should have guaranteed conquest had been rendered useless by terrain, by tactics, and by warriors who understood both. Karlsefni faced the hardest decision of his life. His wife Gudrid stood behind him in the longhouse, holding their son Snorri against her chest. Snorri had been born here, in Vinland, the first European child born on American soil. Karlsefni had crossed an ocean to build a kingdom for that boy. He had imagined Snorri growing up as lord of a new world, speaking Norse under American trees, inheriting a land that stretched beyond imagination. Now he looked at the boy's face and understood that the only inheritance he could give his son was survival. Stay and die heroically, as his culture demanded, or retreat and live with the shame of failure. But shame meant nothing to dead men, and that boy in Gudrid's arms would not grow up at all if his father chose glory over wisdom. The merchant prince proved his wisdom in a way no skald would ever celebrate. To the ships. The order that saved Norse lives but ended Norse dreams. The final native assault came with coordinated precision, simultaneous pressure from all sides. Fire arrows increasing. Tomahawk teams working in pairs. One warrior forcing a Viking to raise his shield, another exploiting the opening from a different angle. The noose tightened with every minute. The retreat became a fighting withdrawal. Vikings formed a hollow square with civilians in the center and fought toward the beach. Every step cost blood. Natives pressed from all sides, sensing that the victory they had earned over 5 days of fighting was within reach. The 100 yards to the ships felt like miles. Men who had conquered half of Europe found themselves running from hunters carrying stone weapons. 5 Vikings volunteered for the rearguard. They knew what it meant. According to the sagas, their names were Thorgeir, Snorri, Grimolf, Thorhall, and Kettle. They would hold the line while the rest boarded the longboats. They stood shield to shield on the sand, 5 men facing a forest full of warriors who had spent 5 days proving that Viking steel could not save Viking lives. The waves washed at their heels, the tree line filled with shadows. They did not run. They did not look back at the longboats filling behind them. They looked forward, at the arrows and the tomahawks and the warriors emerging from the trees, and they held their ground until holding was no longer possible. Songs should honor their sacrifice, but even the sagas struggled to glorify retreat. As the longboats pushed off, the Vikings abandoned everything they could not carry in one trip. The forge, representing months of labor, left standing. Precious iron tools scattered in the dirt. The anvil, hauled across treacherous seas, abandoned on a beach. Half-built structures that would puzzle archaeologists 1,000 years later. Whetstones, cooking pots, weapons dropped by wounded men. Each item represented dreams of permanent settlement, months of planning, weeks of sailing, years of hope that Vinland would become the next Norse kingdom. Now they were dead weight slowing escape. The natives would collect these treasures in the hours after the longboats vanished. Iron nails worked into arrowheads, forge tools repurposed for native craft. Viking steel, the supposed guarantee of conquest, absorbed into the very culture it had tried to displace. These were not conquerors anymore. They were refugees fleeing for their lives. What they left behind tells the story better than any saga. Iron nails, worth fortunes in Greenland, trampled into mud. The sum of everything they had carried across the Atlantic, abandoned in minutes. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. On the beach, final tragedy struck. As the last longboat pushed off, an arrow whistled from the tree line. It caught the helmsman in the throat. He toppled backward, blood spraying across Karlsefni's face. The boat spun rudderless while men scrambled for the tiller. Even in retreat, even escaping, death followed them to the waterline. That final arrow carried a message more eloquent than any words either side could have spoken. We can kill you whenever we choose. You survive because we allow it. Do not return. On the blood-stained beach, native warriors danced in victory. Women emerged from forest sanctuaries. Children touched abandoned Viking weapons with wonder. Elders nodded at young warriors who had proved themselves against the most feared fighters in the known world. They had done the impossible, defeated iron with stone, expelled invaders without surrendering a single acre. The death count told the story. Vikings, 15 confirmed dead, 23 wounded, several more who would die during the voyage home. 1/3 of their fighting force eliminated. Native losses, disputed by the sagas, but likely fewer than 20 killed. The numbers should have been reversed. Every material advantage had favored the Norse. And yet, Karlsefni made his decision before they reached open ocean. "This land wants us dead," he told his council. No debate followed. Everyone had seen enough. Vinland's riches were not worth Viking blood. The Atlantic would be the boundary, not another Viking highway. The longboats turned east, and the men aboard them carried wounds that would never fully heal. The wounded spoke in whispers during the voyage home. "They fight like forest spirits," one said, an arrow still embedded in his shoulder. Another, delirious with fever, screamed about eyes in the trees. Strong men who had laughed at death now jumped at creaking ropes. The new world had broken something fundamental in Viking confidence. They had met an enemy they could not defeat, on ground they could not master, using weapons they had dismissed as worthless, and the enemy had won. The sagas wrote themselves within a generation. Every Norse hall knew the tale. How Karlsefni the Wealthy became Karlsefni the Wise by retreating. How stone defeated steel. how the New World rejected its would-be conquerors. The Skalds struggled with the narrative. How do you glorify defeat? They focused on individual heroism while acknowledging collective failure. The truth was too important to hide. Modern archaeological evidence confirms what the sagas described. Lanceau Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, reveals Viking buildings exactly where the stories place them. Carbon dating pins the settlement to 1021 AD precisely. Tree rings do not lie. Artifacts match saga descriptions. Even the forge remains, abandoned just as the old accounts claimed. Science validates oral history. The battles happened. The Vikings fled. The natives won. The items the Norse left behind became sacred objects among the native peoples. Karlsefni's abandoned sword became a chief's symbol of authority. Broken Viking shields decorated longhouses for generations. Iron fragments were worked into ceremonial pieces. These were not simply trophies. They were reminders, physical proof that the ancestors had faced demons from across the water and triumphed. Power dynamics shifted among native groups. Those who had fought gained prestige that lasted generations. Warriors wore Viking artifacts as proof of what they had done. The battle sites became sacred ground. Stories spread through trade networks across the continent. The pale strangers could be beaten. Unity against invaders became cultural memory that would persist for 5 centuries. Consider the implications of what happened in those forests. If Vikings had established permanent settlements, history shifts completely. Columbus discovers a continent already carved into Norse kingdoms. Native populations face European diseases 400 years earlier, when the demographic collapse would reshape civilizations still at their height. The Aztec and Inca empires encounter Norse expansion at full strength, not weakened Spanish conquistadors arriving centuries later. Everything changes. 500 years of human civilization redirected by stone arrowheads and forest warfare in Newfoundland. The defensive template was established in those woods. Future invaders, when they finally came in different ships with different weapons and different diseases, would face descendants of warriors who had already won this war once. The parallel lessons echo through centuries. Afghanistan earned the title Graveyard of Empires using identical principles. Soviet technology and American firepower both failed against defenders who merged with landscape. Vietnam taught the same lesson. Technological superiority means nothing when every step might be your last, when the land itself seems hostile, when defenders need only patience while invaders need everything. The deeper truth transcends military history. The Vikings represented inevitability, technological superiority, expansionist ideology, demographic pressure. They should have won. Every material advantage favored them. Steel over stone, armor over hide, ships over canoes. Yet they did not just lose. They were so thoroughly defeated that they never tried again. Their entire culture, built on the assumption that bold expansion was rewarded by the gods, accepted a boundary for the first time in their history. Why? Because warfare is not just about weapons. It is about will, knowledge, and the bond between a people and the ground beneath their feet. The natives possessed what Vikings could not buy, steal, or conquer. Perfect unity between warrior and terrain. Every tree was an ally. Every shadow offered advantage. Every trail was a highway for defenders and a maze for invaders. You cannot conquer a people who are the land they defend. Vikings understood oceans. Natives understood forests. In Newfoundland, forest trumped ocean. Go back to that opening image one last time. Battle-hardened Vikings running through the trees, arrows whispering past their heads. Behind them, shadows that move faster than armored men can flee. The most feared warriors on earth, running from hunters with stone weapons. The outcome should have been conquest. Instead, stone won. Patience conquered aggression. Knowledge defeated strength. And the pivot point of 5 centuries of human history was a stone arrowhead in Viking flesh, proving that sometimes the old ways are stronger than the new. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. There are always darker corners still to come.